Previously in Hedge Knights, the Curtain Wall Grove was converted over to a cycloid field. Additional areas around the keep were slated to be purified, like the Merlin Gates and commonly used walkways. A horde of savage raiders attacked the keep, but were fended off by archers and arrows. And Judea, with the help of the other masons, finished the final section of the boundary wall. Episode 34, Reptilian Raiders. After the immense amount of effort it took to complete the boundary wall, the Atlas discussed what next project they could undertake. The Atlas were tired of carefully avoiding polluted areas within the keep. They asked Megahoof if it might be possible to fully purify everything within the curtain walls. Megahoof paused a moment while visibly attempting to calculate the strain it might put on the boundary salix trees, and then said the trees should manage it just fine, especially if the hill root is harvested for more extracts. This would mean relocating 2 of the remaining salix trees within the curtain wall outside and planting it around the boundary, something that Sapo planned to do in the morning. Megahoof met with Lazarus and Sapo to get reassurances that the hill root would be ready for harvest soon. If the curtain wall was to be fully purified, additional trees would need to be added to the grove. Sapo and Lazarus reassured Megahoof that they had been carefully monitoring the plants for blight, fungus, and what few pests still inhabit the soil, and barring any unforeseen tragedies, the hill root would be soon stocked on the shelves as medicine. Lazarus turned his attention towards the ambrosia, which he and Sapo left to ripen on the vine. Knowing that Megahoof intended to distill more extract, he thought it might be time to add the latest batch of ambrosia to the ever-growing stockpile. Lazarus still felt too ill to make the trek out towards the boundary arboretum to help Sapo with relocating the salix trees, but he could still prepare the trees for transport by digging up and cropping the roots, bounding the roots with soil in burlap, and then tethering the tree to a tree sledge so that all Sapo had to do was lead the bison out towards the edge of the grove and then replant the tree in root ball. Sapo enjoyed his morning meal and relaxed at the dining table, chatting with everyone else as he lounged. He noticed the telltale sounds of picks and shovels hacking away at soil, too dull of a sound to be stone cutting or slate mining, and headed out to see Lazarus finishing most of the work for him. He started to jokingly scold Lazarus for planning to relocate the trees to the boundary arboretum himself because he was already so stricken with pollution symptoms, but halfway through his half-hearted rant he realized Lazarus had already walked away from the trees, and then Sapo said, "Wait, you left them for me, didn't you?" And Lazarus chuckled as he nodded so hard his helmet nearly fell off. Lazarus then turned around, raised his visor and smiled while he offered to do one of the 2 trees. Sapo raised an eyebrow and asked if he felt well enough to be that far into the muck and mire of the swamps, and Lazarus nodded again, but less emphatically. Once they were done, they both carefully harvested the latest batch of heel root after having made promises to Megahoof that the harvest wouldn't go awry. Sapo mentioned to Lazarus that he thought the gossypium looked fairly ready to harvest as well. Lazarus told him that he'd inspect the plants once they were done with the heel root, but also mentioned that Klein might know what the raw plant would look like at maturity, so he might be the better person to ask. Klein took a quick look at the gossypium and mentioned the fluffy white bulbs should be a little larger, maybe just leave the plant a few more days at most. Soon the Atlets would have another textile to scour, clean, prepare, spin, and dry. With the boundary wall fully completed, Tangier and Judea came up with an idea to use the walls to their defensive advantage by constructing a set of walls to lead the raiders towards the main gate and its defense of Merlins. The initial design was crude and simple. They wanted to see if their proof of concept even worked, before refining the idea and constructing it properly. Seeing the progress of the Gossypian plants, Klein started to sketch different designs for protective clothing. His technique to limit pollution exposure was to use two different types of fabric that were tightly woven with fine threads, and align the fabrics so that the top layer of fabric's grain was at a 45-degree angle to the bottom layer's fabric. The layered and tightly woven fabric technique could be applied to almost any design, and was similar to how Lazarus made his gambesons. The resulting clothing was much heavier and insulating, which was problematic in the hot Rhiza forest, but would be less of an issue in the colder Cotraro forest. The technique was also incredibly textile inefficient, meaning that in Pennacook only the scouts were awarded such finely woven clothing. Depending on the yield of the Gossypium harvest, it might be possible to make at least facewear for everyone, but additional pieces like gloves, trousers, and tunics were ideal. Klein hadn't ever worked with bison wool before, so he spent some time experimenting with the wool to figure out how to reduce the bulky bolts of wool down as finely as possible. He worried that the wool might offer too much insulation, but he'd only know for sure once the first pieces were finished. Klein found the bison wool to be far tougher and warmer than the other wool he'd seen. The other wool pieces he had worked on were antique clothing centuries old, and in poor and ratty condition that often needed mending. In the high Adalic kingdoms, it was common for people to wear sheep or alpaca wool, and modern-day Adalics cherished their heirloom garments for their warmth and water resistance. Bison, on the other hand, were never ranched, as they were powerful and fairly aggressive, but somehow the squires had domesticated them anyway, something that the high Adalic kingdoms had failed to do. The special properties of the wool might allow for the pieces to be less insulating, while still remaining robust. Klein's investigations into the wool was interrupted by alarm bells in a pattern that signaled feral creatures. The castle quickly went into lockdown, and the archers fetched their weapons and headed for the arrow loops. The main gate's counterweights were released and the gate came slamming shut. Meguf told the archers to use careful aim. Their quarry were fast and small. It was a good opportunity to practice pinpoint precision. The Adalics had travel plans to head to the ancient ruins, and Megahoof and Sappho hoped that some of the animals would be butcherable so they could dry the meat on racks for preserved provisions. Manhunting animals were no longer a serious threat to the Adalics, not since the time two giant white bears berserked their way through the main gate. The entire boundary wall made it easy to spot incoming packs of animals well in advance. Given a little more ingenuity and construction materials, it might also be possible to fashion counterweighted doors to the entrance tunnel to shut in case of such threats, shutting the animals out of the entire glade while also incorporating arrow loops to fire in on the feral creatures. Judea took the opportunity to correct the other Adalics' posture and form while they fired on the few iguanas that remained. She knew well enough not to offer any advice to a veteran like Dave, but Mansi and Klein were both eager for the instruction. Lazarus grew tired of looking after the children while everyone else was having archery practice, and decided to reopen the main gate and mercifully finish off any iguana that were able to traverse the volley of arrows to get to him. Megahoof turned toward Sappho and nodded while saying, "I guess we're postponing our Salix trip, huh?" The two were planning on heading out the following day, but now with all of the iguana to butcher, they'd have to spend the first of summer in the kitchen instead. There was also the matter of the multitude of blight-stricken corpses. Leaving the corpses to rot into the soil could bring further disease, so the Adlets would need to stoke the crematorium fires and prepare for a day of stomach-churning corpse handling. Sappho wondered as a physician why some of the creatures were in such an advanced state of rot while others were fresh and safe to eat. Often he'd witness rats and raccoons succumb to their exposure, and in every case they'd be in an advanced state of decay when they died, much like how the salix trees rapidly disintegrated. But with the feral packs of animals, some were spared while others were not. He speculated there might be a social component to manhunting animals. Like if the leader of the group goes feral, it triggers the others to follow suit, even if their levels of exposure aren't quite as high. In any case, he was glad that not all of the corpses would have to go to waste. The Adlets worked as a collective to clean up, haul, and butcher the iguanas, so the task didn't solely sit on Sappho and Megahoof's shoulders. It was a rare occurrence, outside of combat, that so many Adlets buzzed around the castle in the wee hours of the morning. But that's what duty called for, and everyone answered the call. Madzi was ambushed by a maddened waste rat, despite how sore her hands were from all of the archery practice the previous day. Her experience had paid off, and she killed the rat with the first arrow she loosed from her bow. She was beaming with pride and wished that Judea had seen her small victory, but unfortunately no other Adlets were witness to her bullseye. Between taking shifts with Sappho, Meghu finished distilling the final hybrid extract for the Salix excursion, and was eager to hit the road, but knew there was still more work to be done in the kitchen. He longed for the days where he could pore over his books, tomes, and manuscripts. He had enough competency in the kitchen, but absolutely no passion. It didn't help that much of the tasks were milling wheat by hand or brewing endless batches of tea, drudge work lowly enough to bore even the most enthusiastic chef. Soon, they'd be finished butchering all of the iguanas, and he'd get to roam the countryside, putting his alchemical concoctions to good use once again. Megahoof paused a moment from skinning iguana to let the carpenters know they'd almost certainly need additional racks to dry out the meat in bulk, so that none of their efforts would spoil. The iguanas were small, but even so, the pantry was slowly getting stocked with stacks of reptilian meat bits, and in the summer sun, if they didn't salt and dry the meat quickly, it would be ruined for good. Judea took the time to not only build several more drying racks, but she decided to place down wooden walkway paneling to make it easier to access the racks, and also to catch any milled grain or fallen meat. Just as she was wrapping up her work, lightning struck not too far from where she stood. She grabbed her tools and headed indoors, leaving the walkway unfinished. The boundary wall required quite a lot of timber, and as a result, Lazarus and Sappho had to fell many of the trees around the castle, meaning that the castle and windmill stood alone along the skyline. Fortunately, the castle was very well protected by lightning, with a lightning rod already. The Adlets didn't want the sulfuric air of the geyser to stink up the keep, but also wanted to benefit from the heat of the geyser, so Lazarus had designed a way to allow the heat of the steam geyser to heat iron rods that were embedded into the entire length of the chimney and then buried underground to provide radiant heat from subterranean iron pipes. The iron pipes for radiant heat acted as a perfect lightning rod, and the entire contraption was deeply embedded in thick slate, so the lightning never posed a threat to the castle's occupants. Madzi, on the other hand, didn't have a healthy fear of lightning, and finished Judea's work amidst the lightning storm. After multiple days of hard work defending from the mess of iguanas, the Adlets broke bread together with a little party, and also a way to wish Sappho and Megahoof luck on their excursion. As the party ended, Lazarus asked if both of the cooks really had to go venturing out together, leaving the rest of them to fend for themselves in the meantime. Sappo looked around the table, and while glaring, asked if anyone else besides him and Megahoof felt truly healthy and free of exposure symptoms. Knowing that Sappo would commit anyone who claimed to be healthy to a battery of invasive tests, nobody made a peep. Megahoof and Sappo then packed up their travel gear and prepared the bison for the trip. They let everyone know they were headed straight north if they needed to be found, and intended to make the trip as short as possible. The weather had cleared, and the bison were clearly rearing for open pasture and eager to romp about. The plan to offer the bison a pasture had stalled out when the pasture land sprouted ambrosia, but the squires hadn't forgotten their previous wishes to offer the bison space to graze. While Megahoof and Sappo were out trying to obtain additional salix trees, the rest of the adlets worked to purify as much of the curtain courtyard as they could, knowing the new trees would soon be planted around the boundary, able to absorb the bagged up sludge. Sappo spotted a salix tree and figured there were several more in the area, but the two couldn't find the typical purified slice of forest they grew to expect when seeking out new trees. Since neither of them intended to take longer than what was absolutely necessary, they figured they'd just make camp despite the rampant pollution. After tethering the bison so they wouldn't wander away, the two quickly scanned the area for additional trees. Death stinger hornets were also spotted, but after Tangier and Lazarus's run-in with them, Megahoof and Sappo knew they posed far less of a threat than originally thought, and all you really had to do was avoid them and they'd leave you alone. Sappo took a quick nap while Megahoof rounded up a few bison that got loose from a bad knot. The two were already tired and felt like they needed some shut-eye, even though there was nowhere safe to rest. Digging up multiple salix trees was arduous work, so being well rested was necessary. It started raining back in the glade, and Judea worried that her husband was going to be miserable when returning home. Roughing it out in the wilds was bad enough, but when you don't plan to make a proper shelter and you get rained on, it's nearly unbearable. Nowadays, any cave or natural shelter that could protect you from the elements would almost certainly already be occupied, either by hornets, waste rats, or worse. Sappo awoke, itchy and uncomfortable, having slept on the polluted forest floor, and decided it would be best to tackle the work as fast as he could so he could get home. While Megahoof was pretty decent company, death stinger hornets, grunting and grumpy bison, and polluted fields as far as the eye could see left much to be desired. While Sappo dug around the roots of the tree, Megahoof managed to deliver extract and set up tree sledges so that hitching them to the bison would be quick and easy. The two collaborated like a well-oiled machine. They'd be on the road in no time. Even in the thick polluted smog and dark twilight conditions, the two had finished uprooting, treating, and sledging all 3 trees and were ready to head south triumphantly. Back in the keep, Klein told Lazarus he thought the Gossypium looked like it was matured and ready to be picked. Klein suggested leaving the bowls of fluff in the light rain, as it might even help to clean the white fibers. Much of the other crops appeared to be maturing as well. Soon there'd be a massive harvest, and Judea worried the pantry would overflow once again. Everyone was quite excited about Klein's plans to make more protective clothing. The squires hadn't been home in a few years, and their families back home likely assumed they all had perished. Clothing that could protect them for the trip both to the kingdom ruins and also to Hillinor Island would be invaluable. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights, episode 34, Reptilian Raiders. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to become more involved in my gaming community, a link to Discord can be found in the description of this video or on my website, Rhadamant.com, which also has a link to Twitch, as well as countdown timers to upcoming streams. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. Thank you so very much. I hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow adlets.